Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
So I always forget this part, so I made a note so I would remember to introduce myself. Regularly, Constitution Day, I just start talking and then Augie says, you haven't told them who you are. So let me tell you briefly who I am. I'm Nia Rogers. I'm the librarian for political science for Wilder School and for Robertson School. So all of those you'll notice have a thread of public administration and public policy involved in them because those y'all are my people. I would like to thank some people this evening, please, if we could. Dean Irene, who is in the back, thank you so much. Dean Irene Harold, we just call her Dean Irene affectionately in the library. Dean Irene Harold and Dean Catherine Ingracia are the two deans for our groups, and they are uber supportive of our Civil Discourse podcast, which is one of the hosts tonight. The library's political science and the Civil Discourse podcast are hosting this evening. I'd like to thank the team who put this together. We have the magical Ryan. We have the magical Julie, who you can't see because she's hidden. We have Sue, who did all of our prep work, and we have Valerie, who is our collection manager for political science. She buys us cool stuff. And she's also a government document specialist, like I'm a government document specialist. So we have a whole bond over that as well. So tonight we have with us Dr. Alex Kina, who is an associate professor in the political science department. I have written on here, my note that says his specialty is gerrymandering. And then I realized that you might take that as he gerrymanders things. And while that may be the case, that is not what I'm copying to tonight. What I'm saying is that he studies that as his research area. We also have Dr. Alexandra Reckendorf. Many of you may know her as Allie. She is also an associate professor in the political science department, and she is the associate chair. Her specialty in research is public opinion and political behavior, why people vote the way they vote and how they act politically. And then on this end, we have my podcast partner, because everything is in relation to me, Dr. John Augenbaugh, who everybody here probably knows as Augie. And he is also an associate professor in the political science department. His specialties are, of course, public administration and the U.S. Supreme Court, who we affectionately refer to as SCOTUS, and the chief, who we refer to as J-Rob. Because I can do that because I'm like on a first name basis with him. Anyway, so how the evening is going to play out, these folks are going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes each. And we're starting with Allie, right? Then we're going to Augie, and then we're going to Alex. And then we'll have a Q&A. You'll be able to ask questions. Although I reserve the right to ask the first question because I'm the host. Anyway, thank you so much, and we'll get started.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'll start by saying that when Nia and Augie asked me to participate in a Super Tuesday panel, my first thought is why? We've already known who the candidates were going to be for years. So what could we really say about Super Tuesday? And in fact, in that way, I hadn't really even been following it that well. So I had to do a little bit of research today on a couple things. But when I would tell people, well, we know that it's going to be Donald Trump and we know it's going to be Joe Biden, generally got a lot of backlash when it was, 2021, because how can you tell the future? And it's not that I have a crystal ball, because we don't, but there were some things that, unless they happened, were pointing towards the very situation that we're in now, which is where both of those candidates have now mathematically locked up the number of pledged delegates needed to get their nomination later in the summer at their convention. Because when we vote, even though we're casting our ballot for a person, kind of like the Electoral College, there's a middleman or a middle woman who actually goes somewhere else and casts a vote based usually on what we've told them to do. So health was one of those question marks, right? At some point, still could happen. Somebody could fall ill, croak, whatever. And that would change the race. The other question was really just, did they want it? right? And if either of them had said yes, it was kind of assumed they'd end up the nominee. As soon as the public's reaction to January 6th was not one of universal outrage on both sides of the aisle, it kept that door open for Donald Trump, and his floor has always been around 30-ish some percent, right? Which already puts him in a pretty good position if he's trying to persuade the remaining voters. For Biden, some people seem to have this memory of Biden saying he would only run one term. And that never happened. You're not going to find any sort of quote from Joe Biden saying that, but you're going to hear people mad at Joe Biden because he lied when he said he was going to step down after one term. Now, I did some research to find why people would say that. Around 2019, some of his advisors were saying things like, if Biden's elected, he's going to be 82 years old in 4 years, and he won't run for re-election again. Others described his term as a transition term or a bridge term before he put the baton in somebody else's hand. But he never said that. And in fact, people wanted him to take a pledge saying he would only run once, and he never signed that pledge. So he didn't sign it. Incumbents usually run again. And unless he had stepped aside early on to let Democrats fight it out, it probably wasn't going to happen. And if you're the Democratic Party, you don't want people fighting it out. So unless you think that he'd say, hey, Kamala's next in line, and then Gavin Newsom or Bernie Sanders or anybody else would just say, cool, let her have it. The Democratic Party was going to stick with Joe Biden. On the Trump side, a lot of people would react negatively when I said, well, it's kind of inevitable, guys. You might not like it, but you have to deal with it. Because they would argue that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, if you're saying it and people believe you, then it's what's going to happen, right? And I understand a little bit of that, because if you don't like Donald Trump, you might want to hold out some hope. And in fact, you could hold out some hope all the way through New Hampshire. But I mean, it would have been a lie. So if I sat on panels in 2021 and said, oh yeah, lots of people stand a really good chance, it wouldn't have felt honest from a scholarly perspective, even if technically, yes. And technically he could still not be the nominee, but there's nothing leading us to believe that. He's locked it up numerically. He's not going to go to jail. And I think that even if he ended up in jail, he could still serve as president from a cell. There's nothing preventing it. So he's going to be the nominee. Also, the media has a stake, though, in making the races in the primary sound more interesting than they are, because they need you to click on it. And also sometimes I think the media gives them a little too much credit, the Republican Party, and they act shocked when Republicans line up to endorse Donald Trump, as if they have any sort of honor. That was an editorial, but we'll get to Ted Cruz in a moment. So we've locked it up, and actually the parties like that. So parties want to know who their candidates are early on. This is different than in other countries. In fact, our neighbor to the south, Mexico, you can only campaign between the primary and the general election for a total of 147 days. Primary 60 days, general election is 90 days. They have to stop 3 days before election day to give you guys, some breathing room from the TV ads, I suppose. Canada in 2016, that's the most recent data I had, sorry. 2016, Canada, their highest election lasted 78 days. In the UK that year, it was 139 days. In the US that year, Ted Cruz announced his candidacy 596 days before the election. And so that's why Americans hate politics. But why do the parties like it, even if the people say they hate it? Well, that's something that's just a trend in all things politics. But one, he's also a money guy in addition to gerrymandering. The parties want to raise money, and they want to raise as much of it as they can. And if they know who the candidate is, they can start earlier. Also, they'd rather spend more time fighting their opponent, the general election person, than they do wanting to infight between themselves to determine who the candidate is. So the parties actually are fine with this, even if the people get exhausted by it. Also, that means that the parties sometimes allow states to determine rules that will get the primary over with fairly quickly. So in the Republican Party, part of the reason that we knew that Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, like, they were going to have an uphill battle was because the GOP let states adopt rules for how they allocate their delegates to the convention. In most of the states now allow some degree of a winner-take-all system or a winner-take-most system as opposed to a proportional system of delegation, which is what Democrats used. So even though Iowa and New Hampshire were proportional, they're fairly small. And there were multiple people in the race, which meant that Trump got more of a lead than he would have if it had only been a couple candidates in the race, right? Because he, I think, got like 51% of the vote in Iowa this primary, but he got 20 of the delegates. Haley and DeSantis, I think, each got about 9. And then Ramaswamy, I don't know if I pronounced that right, might have got 1 or 2, I think. So even though that's proportional, nearly all the states afterwards are more winner take all or some hybrid where they get most. So of the 27 states plus DC that have voted so far in the primary, if I did my counting correctly, there were only 5 GOP primaries or caucuses that were determined proportionally, which means all you need is the most, or in some, a majority, and you're going to get all of them, kind of like the Electoral College, right? Which makes sense then if you're looking for a candidate that can win the Electoral College, which is a whole different thing. And 12 of the remaining 24 states have winner take all, which means that, like, he's locked it up now, but even if it was close, he was going to be able to wrap it up really soon after that, because all you need is a plurality in a lot of those states. So Haley had a misstep in Nevada, which after she came in 3rd in Iowa and 2nd in New Hampshire, because everybody else had dropped out, I think. In Nevada, she ran in the primary, but the primary doesn't have any delegates. They also held a caucus where Trump ran and Trump won and he got all the delegates, because you could only be on either the primary ballot or on the caucus ballot. And she picked the wrong one. And I don't know if you guys know if that was like strategic, like she thought she was going to get media bump of, oh, look, she won an uncontested race, but that didn't happen. None, like, we don't want any of these people beat out Nikki Haley. That was an option on that ballot. None of these people beat Nikki Haley in Nevada. That doomed her. She did stay in through Super Tuesday, but even here in Virginia, where we have, I think we're a hybrid system of sorts. I think we're like winner take all hybrid, which means if you get over 50%, you're going to get a lot of the extra delegates, but districts, congressional districts, each get 3. And if you get a majority in those, you'll get that. So she won Fairfax and Albemarle. I'm not a native Virginian. And so she got 6. So she got 6. Trump got 42, even though the split was 63% to 35%. The other thing about Virginia is we don't know how many of those 35% of people that voted for Nikki Haley were actually Democrats, because Virginia is an open primary state. So in 2016 and 2024, I went over and voted in the Republican primary, even though traditionally, I'm going to out myself because I'm a liberal college professor, I assume, is that I usually vote for whoever's the Democratic candidate. But here, you don't have to be locked in. You can cross the aisle. So we don't even know how many of those 35% of people were Republicans who even stood a chance of being somebody who would have voted for the Republican candidate come the general election. So that's something that's kind of interesting too. And so what happens is he wins Iowa and lots of people say, enough, we've seen enough. That's all I need. So Ted Cruz again says something along the lines of, well, I've seen all I need to see. Whoever wins Iowa, that's all I was waiting for. And what's ironic about that is Ted Cruz won Iowa in 2016. So again, a man of integrity. But the party was ready to rally behind him because they wanted this thing kind of over. There could be other reasons too, but I can't speculate on those things. So now we get to the question of Joe Biden's support. So Joe Biden, the big questions have been, well, what about the effect of Gaza on votes of young people and Muslim Americans? So for Muslim Americans, we can look at Michigan, which has a very large Muslim population in the Detroit suburbs. And in Michigan, you can vote for uncommitted. And this year, 13.2% of people in Michigan said uncommitted. And it was about 17% in the county that is home to Dearborn. That's about 101,000 votes. Now, this is only about 2.5% more than actually voted uncommitted in 2012 when Barack Obama was the incumbent. So it's not that much more, but in a state like Michigan, which is a swing state that Joe Biden only won by 154,000 votes, more or less, it's one of those things he's going to have to look out for. Other states, we've seen much higher percentages of no preference or uncommitted than during that 2012 election with Obama. But in Virginia, for example, 11.5% voted for one of the other two candidates, Marianne Williamson, who thinks we should just envision a better world and it'll happen. And Dean Phillips, who is an actual elected congressman who probably has not much of a political future in front of him now because he's running against an incumbent. But in Georgia, it's only 5% that voted for others. And Michigan, it was only 5.5% that voted for the others. In Minnesota, it was 19.5%. So he's got to watch out for this, but in some states, it's more of a thing than others. And that'll be a matter of strategy. I have a minute and 10 seconds left. So the last thing, young people and Biden. We'll say a lot of things, and I don't think that they're usually worth paying that much attention to because they're generally done poorly these days. If you look at a recent article by The Conversation, Trump is beating Biden with young voters 18 to 29, 49 to 43%. That seems odd to me. Axios published something the exact same week that said, no, actually young people favor Biden by 4%. So the only poll that matters is the poll that we all go in and check the box on in November. But a CBS poll recently also found that 18 to 29-year-olds, their support for Biden is actually up despite the media narrative by about 3 percentage points, whereas every other group they looked at, it was down. So again, take that for what you will, maybe nothing. What I thought was actually a little more interested in polls as I was looking before we got here, and then I'll wrap this up, is that younger people in the 18 to 34 demographic, and sometimes it's hard because sometimes young is 18 to 29, sometimes it's 18 to 34, but it no longer ever captures me. But young people, when asked their highest priority, said the economy. So out of all the things, young people in that age group said the economy. 30% listed it as the highest and was the highest age group that said the economy. Nobody ever talks about young people giving a shit about the economy. Sorry, Nia, but it wasn't one of the ones you asked us not to use. The second highest for 18 to 34-year-olds was guns, and they were also the highest age group that said guns. They were the lowest group that said immigration, which lots of old people really seem to care about. They were surprisingly very low on abortion, did not seem to care about abortion. That surprises me. Afterwards, I can try to convince you otherwise if you want. And then democracy, this is the one I actually care most about. Only 10% of 18 to 34-year-olds said democracy is the most important thing going into this election, protecting democracy in the US. It was the lowest of any age group as well. And that's going to be hard for Biden because Biden is running on not the economy necessarily. I mean, he does, but it's a little tougher. But he's running still on, hey, Republicans don't love democracy anymore. You can buy what he's selling or not, but that's what he's selling. And he's running on democracy abroad in Ukraine as well for foreign policy. So for him, that's maybe one of those things that might be surprising if it's a good poll, and maybe it's not. And with that, I'll shut up because I'm 1 minute and 42 seconds over. Sorry.
Oh, hey, thanks, Ally. Really appreciate that. Good evening, and thanks, one and all, for coming out. Alex, Ally, and I really appreciate have the opportunity to get our political science geek on. When Nia and I organized this event months ago, we really thought that the primaries would be worth discussing, right? I mean, this is a presidential election where it's not an open seat because the incumbent president still can run for re-election. So it's not like 2016 when Barack Obama was term limited. But nevertheless, you would think that the opposition party would have a robust, if you will, primary election process. But as Ali already described, that was all for naught. So that basically forces Ali, Alex, and I to kind of sort of perhaps readjust what we're going to focus on. Ali mentioned just a few moments ago polls. And I'm not going to discuss the polls because much like Ali just mentioned, there's a lot of different polls and there's a lot of different ways you could interpret the polls. Instead, what I'm going to offer in my remarks over roughly the next 10 minutes are some events or variables that perhaps we all might want to focus on or pay attention to because they could have an impact on voter preferences come this November. So Ali mentioned, and it's pretty impossible not to go ahead and have me discuss the GOP nominee Donald Trump's legal issues. And I'm kind of sort of being diplomatic when I say issues, all right? As of this afternoon, there are 4 criminal cases against nominee Trump, totaling 85 indictment charges. Now, some of you might be saying, isn't there 91? Well, earlier today, a Georgia judge threw out 6 of the indictment charges. So now it's down to 85. Only 85, right? 2 of the cases are state cases. The other 2 are federal cases. So far, only 1 of the cases has a trial date. So the New York case, where it is alleged that Trump, when he was running for president in 2016, illegally used campaign money to silence Stormy Daniels. All right. So that's the one case that actually has a trial date, and it's supposed to start March 25th.
Who is Stormy Daniels?
Do I really have to?
They were young. They might not know.
Stormy Daniels is an adult entertainment actor.
Thank you.
All right. And I said that as diplomatically as I could for this particular environment. All right. The Georgia case is waiting on a judge's ruling as to whether or not the prosecutor will either be removed or will the case be dismissed because it is alleged she had an affair with the person she picked to actually prosecute the former president. This is related to events that he engaged in or activities he engaged in to change the Georgia electoral college votes for 2020. The other 2 cases are federal cases. Those cases have been delayed in large part because former President Trump has asked the Supreme Court to rule on his constitutional challenge that he should receive immunity for activities that he engaged in related to January 6, 2021, because he was still president And his legal theory is, as president, he is immune from criminal prosecution. Depending on how and when the Supreme Court rules, we could possibly have a major party nominee for president running for president while he is sitting for trial. In my research, that has never happened before. Now, maybe in the fall, we could go ahead and address the follow-up question that Ally already referenced, which is, could he run for office if he was in jail? By the way, the short answer to that question is yes, because it's already happened in our country's history when Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, ran for president, and in 2020, while he was sitting in jail, actually received about 2% of the popular vote. Yay, Eugene Debs, right? So that's one variable. What happens with all of Trump's legal troubles? Because we could have a scenario where a major party political candidate is running for office at the same time he's supposed to be in court defending himself against criminal charges. Another variable to pay attention to, and Ally just mentioned this as importance to younger voters, and that's the economy. We know this historically, that the economy usually is an important voting choice variable for a percentage of the population. So pay attention to, is inflation continuing to decline, or has it leveled off? What was it yesterday? The Consumer Price Index report was released. We've seen a slight uptick in certain, if you will, costs of goods and services. This can be important to particularly lower middle class, working class, and poorer voters. All right, so that's something to pay attention to, because we political scientists refer to this as retrospective voting, where you look back at the last few years and judging the incumbent office holder. And if you're doing better or your family's doing better, you might have a more positive view of the incumbent, or you'll be less likely to consider the opponent. Another thing to take a look at, Alex, you might get to this, but parties and their bases. How good are the parties at getting out their core supporters? A number of scholars have identified the fact that over the last 20 to 30 years in the United States, the number of undecided independent voters has shrunk, which basically means most of us are either Democrats or Republicans, and it doesn't matter who the candidate of the party is, we will support them. But then the next question becomes, are we motivated enough to get out to vote for our party's candidate? And as Ally chronicled in her remarks, there are a number of good reasons why supporters of both political parties might say, yeah, I really don't like our party's candidate. So how motivated will the bases be in getting out to vote? Another variable to pay attention to, and we know that a small percentage of voters cast their votes because of single issues that are extremely important to them. So Ally mentioned a number of them, whether it was the economy, immigration, abortion, et cetera, right? But to what extent does that important issue to a voter drive them to the polls? Because if otherwise you really don't like either candidate, but you're really animated, passionate about a particular issue, you will pay attention to what the candidates say about that issue, and it may lead you to vote or to vote for the opposition because you don't like their stance on that issue. And then the last thing that I will mention, and Ally briefly touched upon this, whether we like the institution or not, you have to pay attention to the Electoral College. The Electoral College has a huge impact on shaping the candidacies of the major party candidates. And much like the shrinking number of undecided independent voters, the number of battleground states has also shrunk because increasingly most states are either solidly Republican or solidly Democrat. So this puts a huge emphasis, an outsized influence of battleground states where legitimately both parties' candidates think they have a shot. And be skeptical when you hear the media say, well, this is a battleground state. You know, many states aren't battleground states, right? The election results might be close, but they're really not battleground states. But pay attention to those because they may have a huge influence on the election come this fall. And it's really a shame, I mean, in terms of democracy, because it might only be 5 or 6 states. But that's the gist of my remarks for tonight. I want you all to pay attention to some of these key variables because they could have a huge influence on the outcome. Thanks. Alex?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? All right, so one thing as a political scientist that people always assume is that I'm some wizard at predicting future events, which is not the case at all. I can't really predict anything. Political science didn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union. We didn't predict the Arab Spring. We're not that great at, it's really hard to predict human behavior. Humans are kind of unpredictable. But when you turn on the news, you see a lot of people making predictions. And this is kind of disingenuous, dishonest. And the news has like incentives to create sort of infotainment content that's entertaining, that's engaging. But one thing I do focus on when I'm looking at campaigns is I focus on money, because the money that you raise can tell you a lot about who your base is and what your priorities are, and how you spend that money is interesting too. So today in my Congress class, some of my students looked at the different campaign funding bases that our candidates have and how they're actually spending their money. And this to me is what makes this election really super interesting. The election isn't interesting for a lot of reasons that I think we all know, but it's super interesting in some of the unprecedented trends in campaign finance. So to give you some historical context, the growth of campaign spending has outpaced inflation. It's outpaced income growth. It's outpaced medical inflation, the cost of healthcare. It's outpaced college tuition inflation. It's increasing at an exponential rate. And every single presidential election in the last several decades has been more expensive than the previous one. In 2020, the amount of money being spent was roughly double of what was spent in 2016. A lot of this has to do with how the US treats money compared to other democracies. In other democracies, money is heavily regulated. How much money you spend is regulated. In Great Britain, I believe, you might correct me if I'm mistaken, but there's a formula that's tied to how many constituents the office represents that dictates how much money you can actually raise and spend. In the United States, it's a free-for-all. It's a free-for-all because the courts conflate money with free speech. So the courts, from the courts' perspectives, they say that any attempt to restrict spending by rich people is an infringement on their First Amendment right, because money is an expression. So everybody here, you have the right to go out and spend $5 million campaigning for whoever you like. We all have that. It's our constitutionally protected right. So if you would like to do that, you're free to do that. It's essentially similar to laws that say that it's illegal to sleep under a bridge. These are laws that really only affect and target a small group of people. But the result is we have a ton of money flowing into US elections. And one of the things that I try to focus on in my research is, what does this money actually do? What do the candidates do with this money, and what effect does it actually have? Because that's kind of an open debate. Because I remember, those of you who remember 2010 after Citizens United, there was a lot of concern that this would give Wall Street and by extension, the Republicans an unfair advantage. But that didn't really happen. And actually, there's a lot of money flowing from Wall Street to Democrats these days for other reasons. But I want to talk a little bit about what campaigns are doing with all this money. So far, the information we have comes from quarterly reports. Every 3 months, campaigns that are raising money, they have to report who their donors are, their large donors, to the federal government. And those reports get publicized and repackaged. And that gives us insight into campaign finance. We don't have up-to-date information yet. We will in a couple of weeks. But what's unprecedented to me is how the Trump campaign is raising and spending money. The Biden campaign is doing some pretty interesting things as well. The Biden campaign has been super effective at raising money. All Democrats have, because they use the specter of Trump to strike fear in ideological donors on Facebook and online. They have a really advanced digital campaign fundraising platform that they use to solicit money. And they're throwing obscene amounts of money at races across the country. But when you break down what they're actually doing with this money, it's pretty predictable. So the Biden campaign spends a large portion on advertisement. So they'll pay advertisement firms several $1 million to run Facebook ads, ads on, well, not ads on Twitter, because who would want to buy ads on Twitter these days? But across digital media, they'll buy ads. When you're trying to watch the Super Bowl, you'll see ads. When you're trying to watch anything on streaming, now you'll see ads. And it costs a lot of money, so they spend a lot of money. And they'll typically target that in states that matter. Now, right now, Biden isn't really concerned about a primary challenge. So he's preparing for the general election by airing ads that kind of attack Trump. What the Trump campaign is spending money on is unprecedented. I believe it was number 2 or number 3 highest expenditure is on lawyers. Now, this is crazy. And this is something that I noticed a few years ago when Trump was president. Our colleague in political science, Andrea Simonelli, was actually, she worked in campaigns and she has quite a bit of experience with campaign financing and fundraising. And I came to her with this puzzle when I was looking at Trump's expenditures. I said, what are these, $5 million here, $5 million there to law firms? What's going on? It was puzzling to her as well. Now we know that that's part of Trump's modus operandi, is spending on lawyers litigating. But this isn't just litigating election fraud. This is litigating his civil and criminal trials, which is unprecedented. And it actually is very likely a violation of campaign finance law. But unfortunately, the cops in this case are the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission is a federal agency that was created in the 1970s to police campaign financing. But its composition is balanced between Republicans and Democrats. Necessarily, if you were a Democrat, you wouldn't want more Republicans. And if you were a Republican, you wouldn't want more Democrats. But the problem is the Republicans are not willing to enforce federal campaign finance law. So he's spending gobs of money on lawyers, and he's getting this money from donations from people around the country. But he's also using other PACs to do his business. For instance, he has super PACs that will raise millions of dollars. Super PACs are allowed to air commercials for Trump or Biden. They just cannot coordinate with his campaign. But one tactic that we've seen in recent years is that a campaign will shed a staffer, and that staffer will go rogue and start a super PAC. For instance, the largest donors to Trump's friendly super PAC is Linda McMahon, the wrestler person, right? Her husband, Vince McMahon, the wrestler guy. Well, his wife has run for Senate in Connecticut a few times. She spends millions of dollars and always loses, but she's a big fan of Trump. So she's donated more than $5 billion to a super PAC. And Jared Kushner's family business has also donated millions of dollars to the super PAC, which raises concern about what does that term connectedness mean? It's a loophole that allows basically campaigns to forego any of the rules that we've spent the last 50 years trying to erect. But the real question is, what does this money actually accomplish? In the Virginia General Assembly races last year, we saw unprecedented money there as well. Democrats were really good at raising money. In Virginia, there are no campaign finance restrictions. Dominion Energy would donate millions of dollars to candidates across the spectrum, mostly Republicans, and Democrats had the Clean Virginia Fund, which was sort of to counteract all of this money throwing around. And the big question is, does it actually work? Well, there isn't a lot of evidence that it actually helps you win elections, first and foremost. But there is evidence that it changes the nature of the priorities, the issue priorities, the things that we talk about. So to put all of this into perspective, I think what we're looking at are two distinct theories about how you actually win. And one theory has very different implications for whether the question of whether this money is actually effective at helping someone win. So in the 1950s, there was an economist who came up with this idea that you can basically predict the winner of an election based on this thing called the median voter theorem. The median voter theorem was proposed by this guy, Duncan Black, and it was taken later by an economist who sort of expounded on it. But basically the idea is this. In a system with two parties where individual voters can put themselves on a single dimension, a left to right axis. So, most people can do that, by the way, and probably everybody here can, if I drew a line left to right with a center mark, you'd probably put yourself somewhere on that line. In that type of system, formal models show, given a number of assumptions, that the parties that appeal to the median voter, the voter that's situated in the middle, you take all the voters and you figure out where they go, that's how you win. And so campaigns over the past 50 years have been operationalizing this theory, the median voter theorem, under the assumption that in order to win an election, you have to be a moderate. And so what you always see, especially when you tune into CNN, you saw this in 2016 with Hillary Clinton's campaign, is this idea that you have to be extreme in order to appeal to primary voters, and then you have to do the pivot. And the pivot is how you get to the centrists who are waiting out there, the silent majority who are still weighing heavily the two candidates and deciding who are they going to vote for. That's one theory. And if you look at some of the decisions that the Democratic Party has made over the last several years, they very much run their campaigns according to the median voter theorem. That's how Joe Biden ended up winning. It wasn't because the median voter in the Democratic Party liked Joe Biden. It's that most voters thought he was more moderate and he could actually win. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy for many Democrats. Trump, however, represents the opposite idea that comes from political behavior. Political behavior grew out of the 1960s, and it is based on the idea that we should actually study how people think, right, rather than make assumptions about rationality. And the political behavior model expects that candidates should mobilize their base, and that it doesn't really matter to appeal to the median voter. You just need to bring more of your team out to vote than the other team. Trump is like a literal test of this entire model. He won in 2016, not by pivoting to the center, but by doubling down on his absurd and extremist positions that other Republicans felt was political suicide. He won fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, in part because the specter of Trump turned out a million more voters for Democrats than Republicans. And if you look at Joe Biden's campaign in 2020, it was very much run as a median voter model. However, people voted in 2020, not necessarily because they endorsed Biden's policies, but because they were terrified of Trump winning. So here we are, a rematch in 2024. It's probably the least surprising thing ever. And we have once again a test of the median voter theorem. Will it work? Well, Joe Biden is running another median voter theorem campaign. He's trying to find middle ground on things like immigration. Like, there is no middle ground on immigration. Either you don't want immigrants and you're scared of immigrants and think that they're a threat, or you think that they're human beings and you're okay with them going to your schools.
Now try abortion.
Yeah, what's the
Just
middle
have
ground
half
on
a
abortion?
baby, guys.
Okay, maybe a 17-week waiting period. 17-week ban is better. What's the problem is people don't really think like that. People pretty much have picked up a team. They've decided the real play is whether they're going to show up and vote or not. And with Biden, the biggest issue is getting young people to turn out in the way that they did over the last 4 years. Will young people be motivated enough by the specter of Trump, not necessarily by the promise of Biden? Will they be motivated enough by the specter of Trump to show up again? And will Trump be motivating enough to his base, a third of which supported Nikki Haley in a swing state like Virginia, to come out in enough of a majority to win in the states that actually matter.